In today's episode, we're heading down to Moore County to honor two suggestions from one Moore County native. So today I'm going to tell you about Mechanics Hill, and then I'm going to tell you about the Tyson and Jones Buggy Factory. Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is a bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, thank you for joining up. And if you're one of my many returning listeners, thank you again for sticking with me. Now, I have a whole lot to go over before we get started, so I want to say right out of the gate, if you look at the description below, right at the top of the description, it'll tell you when the actual content starts if you want to skip everything I'm about to say, and it's a lot of it. And I've been trying since I've started this show to do a completely raw footage show. I end up doing a lot of heavy editing. I've cut out some of it, but I'm still trying to give you a raw show. So every time I record, I got my little clicker here, but every time I record, I go in saying I'm just going to give you whatever I got. So I'm going to try that again today. We'll see how it goes. So the first thing I want to do today is tell you a listener story. A lot of my episodes, most of my episodes, I have asked everybody, if you have any kind of North Carolina story, send it in and I'll read it on the show. And I finally got one sent in that wasn't my own. It was sent in from Joel Wilson from Iredell County. And this story is told by Dr. Ken Wilson, who's the grandfather of Andrew, Dale, and Kelly Wilson. And it was told to him by his mother, Minnie Wilson, in the 1940s. And I'm going to read this story word for word, just like it was sent in. Located in the Union Grove community of Iredell County in North Carolina, Grassy Knob Baptist Church has served the community since the 1880s. Years ago, the mail for the sparsely populated community came in the way of a mail carrier on horseback. One day, it was getting late when the mail carrier had almost completed his route when he was caught in a spring thunderstorm. The sky was dark with crashing thunder, fierce flashing lightning, and heavy rain. To escape the thunderstorm, he rode up to a nearby church where he dismounted and stepped through the doors and into the church, leaving his horse outside but still holding on to the reins to escape the downpour. From where he stood, he could see all the way to the front of the darkened church with each flash of lightning. With another flash of lightning, he thought he saw something resembling a figure in white near the far end of the church. With the next flash of lightning, he saw the figure again, but much closer. He decided it was time to leave and ran out the church doors, jumped on the back of his horse, and rode away back into the storm as fast as he could go. As the horse galloped along back up the path, he said to himself, "Boy, am I riding." And a strange voice behind him said, "Boy, am I riding too." He rode to a barn and found an old woman from the community clutching to the saddle. Now, I don't know if that story is true, but it's kind of creepy. It's kind of a spooky story, but I really like that story. My grandma, who has long since passed away, so a lot of times we'd hang out at her house and she would pop up with, "Have I ever told you the story of insert something?" And that's a lot like the stories my grandma used to tell. So thank you, Joel, for sending that in, and tell your daddy thank you for writing that up for me. Now, moving on, the next thing I got is my Crackhead Chronicles t-shirt. They finally sent me one. There's the front. Let's turn around here. There's the back of it. And this is the first ever podcast t-shirt I've ever owned. I'm really excited about it. I got it a couple weeks ago, or maybe longer than that, but it's been a while since I've been able to sit down and record. So it's just been sitting on the chair, waiting for me to wear it for the next episode coming up. Thank you guys over at Crackhead Chronicles for sending me that. It's really cool. I'm really happy about it. Next on the list is Tasting NC. And some of you already know about Tasting NC. I don't think I've plugged it on the show yet, but my wife and I have kind of tried our hand together at recording. And it's not a podcast. It's just a YouTube channel. And similar to NC Everything, or the NC Everything podcast, we're tasting anything and everything from North Carolina. I don't remember the slogan. We kind of put it together quick, but we've had a really good time. We're tasting North Carolina foods. We did pimento cheese in the first episode. I think barbecue is the next one that came out. It came out yesterday, which today's May 7th. So barbecue sauce came out May 6th, and the next one should come out June 6th. We're trying to go like maybe one a month. And I have a few others recorded, but I'm not sure how consistent we're going to be able to go with it because we're literally buying a lot of North Carolina foods and trying them. We're going to try to do North Carolina restaurants too. So if you have suggestions for restaurants, I don't know if I can get to it as quickly as I can listener suggestions for this show, but we're definitely going to try to showcase North Carolina foods, restaurants, stuff like that. And a weird jet just flew over the house. I paused the recording for that. We're not too awful far from Fort Bragg. Where I live at is almost smack dab in between Raleigh-Durham Airport and PTI in Greensboro. So we get a lot of air traffic right across our house here. Anyway, I hope that wasn't too loud. But anyway, if you haven't checked out Tasting NC, it's on YouTube and it's under the NC Everything Podcast YouTube channel. All right, back to the podcast. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And you can follow me on Facebook by searching the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook. There's a group there you can join up, and you don't have to answer any questions and look at the rules or none of that stuff. You can just join right up. Now, if you're listening and you'd rather watch on YouTube, you can check the links below or search the NC Everything Podcast on YouTube. And if you're watching and you'd rather just listen, I can be found on most podcast players. Now, normally this is where I'll say, don't forget to visit the website at www.thenceverythingpodcast.com. But I think I'm going to shut the website down. It's not shut down yet, but I'm not getting a whole lot of traffic there, and it is a monthly cost. I'm not really getting a lot of return there, I don't think. I've checked the statistics and stuff. So I think I'm going to shut the website down, but first I got to make sure I can get all my episodes on the thumb drive or whatever. I don't want to lose all those. But eventually, I'm going to shut the website down, and so I'm not going to mention it on the show. I think I'm getting plenty of traffic on YouTube and again, the podcast players. If you want to weigh in on that, feel free to email me. You can contact me through the website, and usually I'll have a contact button in the description. But I will still have, a contact, which will be the NC Everything Podcast at gmail.com. It just won't go through the website whenever I do indeed shut it down. All right, now I think that's all the chit chat. So let's go ahead and get into the episode. Like I said, this is a listener suggestion. It came in from Jake, who now lives in Greensboro, but he's a native of Moore County. He suggested two things, and I felt obliged to put them both in this one episode. One was Mechanics Hill, and the other was the Tyson and Jones Buggy Factory. Thank you, Jake, for the suggestions. Now, Mechanics Hill is the shorter of the two, so I'm going to start with that. It sounds like a nickname for like a hangout spot, but it's actually the name of a community down in Moore County. You probably won't find Mechanics Hill on a map today. The area today is known as Robbins. It's located about 12 miles northwest of Carthage, or about 20 miles from Briscoe. And I've been to Carthage. I don't think I've been to Briscoe, but I try to locate the places I talk about. I'm pretty sure I've never been to Robbins / Mechanics Hill, but it's definitely somewhere I'm probably going to try to check out next time I get out that way. But let's go back to before Robbins was Mechanicsville, and when Mechanicsville was just a spot in the woods. Actually, let's leave that spot in the woods for a few minutes and head up to Philadelphia. There was a man up there named John Alexander Kennedy. He was a very skilled gunmaker. He was so skilled that he was tasked with providing arms for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And so he had a pretty good gig going. That's until the British finally took Philadelphia. John Kennedy packs up and heads south, ending up in North Carolina. Eventually, John Kennedy had a son named David, He teaches David all he knows about making guns. So, of course, when David gets some years under his hat, he decides to follow the family business and open his own gun factory. He goes to a gun shop owned by a man named William Williamson and offers to buy half the gun shop and start a partnership. And Williamson agrees. So he partners up with Williamson and they run the gun store together. He must have had a pretty good business going, because when his partner William decided he wanted out of the gun business, David Kennedy gladly bought up his part of the ownership. But David wasn't short-handed. He called in a couple of his brothers and they started expanding the business. They bought an old mill that was on the banks of Bear Creek, and then they dammed that creek up. Now that they had a way of harnessing the water power, they started buying some water-powered machinery like drills, hammers, and grindstones. The grindstones would shape the barrels, which would then be put into a mold for drawing out. And that's a forging term. You got like a hot metal rod and you hammer it a certain way so it makes the bar longer. The hammers were water-powered trip hammers. After the guns were made, you had to set the sights on them. Now, if you've never sighted in a gun, here's more or less how you do it. You aim down the sights of the barrel and fire at the target. And then you measure how far off from the bullseye you are, and you change the sights to where the bullet is actually hitting. The Kennedy boys would do this by shooting at a target that was across Bear Creek. One thing I haven't mentioned is that these Kennedy boys were what they called gun mechanics. It's not really a term that's used much anymore. A lot of gun mechanic work now is just called gunsmithing. Eventually, a community started growing around the factory. Two names eventually came to the community, but I don't know which one of them came first. The area came to be known as Mechanics Hill. The factory was called Mechanicsville. So you got Mechanicsville, the factory, and Mechanics Hill, which is where the factory is located. And as you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, the sun finally just popped over the hill. It's like 6:30 in the morning. And now the sun is blinding me. I look kind of funny on camera, so I may have to adjust here in a minute. Anyway, you got Mechanicsville and Mechanics Hill. After the area became more populated, a post office was finally built, and the name Mechanics Hill became official. By 1810, the factory was making almost 700 rifles a year. 2 years later, in 1812, business was booming when the Kennedys got a contract from the government to produce rifles for the War of 1812. Unfortunately, after the War of 1812, David Kennedy started a downturn. He started operating his business on credit, and people weren't paying. It got so bad that he finally had to sell the business. Then he had to sell his land and his house. David Kennedy left North Carolina for good. He moved to Alabama, where he passed away a few years later. Today, the factory is gone, but it was near the site of the Robbins water plant. But next time I get out that way, I may try to get by Robbins and try to find that Robbins water plant and maybe take a few pictures of where Mechanicsville actually stood. But that's the story of Mechanics Hill. Now I'm going to take a little break and see if that sun doesn't change a little bit so I don't look so goofy on camera. And then we're going to come back and talk about the Tyson and Jones Buggy Factory. All right, that's a little bit better. I like recording early in the morning, but I do have to fight with the sun every once in a while. So, the Tyson and Jones Buggy Factory. Originally, I was just going to cover the Buggy Factory because that was the actual suggestion. But then I realized when I researched, you can't really talk about the Buggy Factory without giving the history of Carthage. And so now you're going to get it all. You're going to get Carthage and more or less the history of Moore County. It's the later half of the 1700s, and Scottish immigrants are looking for a new place to settle down. They've been traveling northwest from the coast, following the Cape Fear River, and finally they come to a big old hill not too far from the river. They like to look at the place, and they decide this is it. They start setting up a community. Now, at this time, there still was no official town. It was just a bunch of Scots camped out on the hill, really. But then something happened in 1784. A new county was formed from part of Cumberland County. The new county was named Moore County after a Revolutionary War captain named Alfred Moore. I may cover him in the future. Anyway, now we have this Moore County, which is mostly empty except for some Scots on a hill. But like with all my other county episodes, a county needs a central place for county government, a county seat. A committee was put together to decide on a spot, and so they found a place in the middle of the county on the property of a man named Richardson Fegan. Now, I don't know if that's Fegan or Fagan. It's Feagan. But anyway, they built a courthouse on the spot, and they called the town Fagansville. Now, we're going to go down a courthouse rabbit hole for a few minutes because Moore County has had a few. It may get a little confusing. When I was doing the research, it was really confusing. Anyway, courthouse number 1 was built in 1785 along the banks of Killets Creek. Even though the courthouse was basically a log hut, having a courthouse meant you were getting serious about your settlement. Now, at this time, the settlement bounced between Fagansville and Moore Courthouse, the name Fagansville and the name Moore Courthouse. Then in 1814, we get courthouse number 2 because they realized that a log hut beside a creek it really wouldn't do it for a proper town. This courthouse number 2 was made of actual lumber, and it was called the Red House. A few years later, in 1818, the town's name was permanently changed to Carthage, which is the name of an African city, though I'm not sure why they decided to name this town after an African city. But with the new town name, we get courthouse number 3. You see, in 1837, the floors of courthouse number 2, the Red House, well, they fell in. Seeing as the current courthouse was now unusable, they decided to build number 3. They tried logs, they tried lumber, but now they were going to go with brick. Kind of sounds like the 3 Little Pigs. Anyway, courthouse number 3, the brick one, was put up, but then in 1889, it caught fire and it was mostly destroyed. Guess what? Courthouse number 4. For number 4, they didn't go with iron or diamond or any kind of new material. They built it out of brick again, but nothing happened to courthouse number 4, even though they did eventually build courthouse number 5. Courthouse number 5 was built in 1922, mainly to replace number 4. I don't think anything was wrong with number 4 when they built number 5. I think they just like building courthouses at this point. I say this because eventually they built courthouse number 6 right across the street from courthouse number 5. Today, number 5 is the courthouse that's in the middle of the giant traffic circle that's in Carthage. So now that we're done with all the courthouses, let's back up to 1850 and talk about a guy named Thomas Bethune Tyson. He was a Carthage resident who was ready to make a name for himself. He buys a wagon repair shop from a man named Isaac Sewell, and he takes over the business. 6 years later, he meets a man named Alexander Kelly, and they decide to become partners in the wagon business. Eventually, they decide to add carriage making to their resume. At this time, the company is known as Tyson and Kelly. The next year, now 1857, Tyson brings on a former slave to help him out. And yes, slavery was still a very real thing at this time, but this guy, the former slave, William T. Jones, was a freed slave. Jones's job was painting the carriages and getting them ready for sale. Turns out, Jones was quite the worker, and Tyson was impressed. So as the business grew and expanded, Jones was brought on as a partner rather than just a regular employee, and the name was changed to Tyson, Kelly, and Company. And Jones, obviously, was the company. When the Civil War broke out, Jones left the company and volunteered to serve. He ended up in the 35th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. He fought with the Confederacy until he was captured near Petersburg, Virginia in 1864. From here, he bounced around through a few war prisons until he finally took the oath of allegiance to the U.S. in June of 1865. During the time he was gone to war, General Sherman had came through the area. If you remember from my Bentonville episode, Sherman wasn't too kind to southern towns. He tore the town up pretty good and the buggy shop had closed. Luckily, William Jones had made quite a bit of money in prison from making moonshine from potato peelings. He sold the moonshine to prison guards and came back to North Carolina with about $3,000 of 1865 money. That would be about 50 grand today. So Jones reopens the buggy shop and invested his money into making it a full-blown carriage factory. He also spent his money to repair the broken town. He pretty much saved the town from ending up on one of those North Carolina lists of abandoned towns. The carriage factory was renamed the Tyson and Jones Buggy Company, and it was the largest factory in the country. Business started booming, and by 1890, they were pumping out 3,000 carriages a year. I read that the factory was doing so well that old Henry Ford himself came to check it out. The story is that Ford wanted to convert the carriage factory into a car factory, but he was laughed out the door. Tyson and Jones thought that this automobile thing was just a gimmick and it would soon be kicked to the wayside, kind of like Blu-ray. However, as you know, the automobile was not a gimmick. It would revolutionize modern travel and ultimately put the Tyson and Jones factory into history books. But before the company died, a fire destroyed one of the two buildings in 1905. The last buggy built at the Tyson and Jones factory was sold to a Rayford man in 1925. The company itself was sold to a group who wanted to start a furniture manufacturing company, but the Great Depression put an end to that plan. Since then, there has been one single building that was the only artifact of the great Tyson and Jones buggy factory. A large fire in town burned part of that building in 1976, but it didn't destroy it. Since then, the town of Carthage has purchased the property and they have plans to renovate the structure. Now, that's based on my research. Today, I hadn't been out there to check this place out. For all I know, the structure has been refurbished and opened. But that's the end of the Tyson and Jones buggy factory part of the show, but not the end of the buggy story. You see, in 1989, the town of Carthage started hosting the Buggy Festival to honor the buggy factory. I read that they were even able to track down some of the original Tyson and Jones buggies for display at the festival. This year will be their 34th annual Buggy Festival, and if I can arrange it, I'm going to go to the Buggy Festival. Unfortunately, it's held on May 13th, so by the time this episode comes out, I'm not looking at my calendar, by the time this episode comes out, the Buggy Festival will have happened. So I'm going to, because I didn't time it out right, I'm going to talk or post about the Buggy Festival on the Facebook page and try to get some of my listeners up there. And I don't like to spoil my shows, but it is in the past. I don't like to spoil my shows, but I will mention that this will be the next episode just to try to help them out and like I said, plug the Buggy Festival. Now, I mentioned earlier about my favorite barbecue restaurant in Carthage, and so I got in my notes here that if I do get to go to the Buggy Festival, I'm not going to miss a chance to check out the new Pick and Pig. And I say this every time I mention one of my favorite places. I'm not getting paid by Pick and Pig to plug them on this show, but I really do love the Pick and Pig. And I say the new Pick and Pig because I think it's probably been a couple years ago now, the original Pick and Pig burned down. There's a lot of fires in this episode. The original Pick and Pig burned down, and they have since rebuilt it, and I've not yet gone out to check out the new place. But Pick and Pig was written about in some food magazine years ago. My wife had seen it, so we went out and checked it out. And the restaurant is on an airstrip, and it's not only some of the best barbecue I've had in the area, but it's beautiful out there. And the kids love it because it's on the airstrip. So you're sitting there eating barbecue and, probably 100 feet away, planes are coming in to land. I was talking to one of the ladies down there a few years ago, and she said it really isn't uncommon for some of the troops from Fort Bragg to fly in on a chopper. I don't know the military aircraft, but they'll fly in from Fort Bragg and have lunch up there. And some days, we were up there one time, and it was probably 30 small planes landed on the airstrip while we were sitting there eating our food. Anyway, Pick and Pig is a really cool place, and it's about an hour from my house, so anytime we get remotely close to Carthage, we try to go up to Pick and Pig. Anyway, that's the Tyson Jones Buggy Factory, Carthage, Moore County, Mechanics Hill, Mechanicsville, and I think that's everything. Again, if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Check me out on YouTube if you're listening. Check me out on podcast players if you're watching. Thank you, Jake, for the suggestion. Thank you, Crack House Chronicles, for the podcast t-shirt. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.